because they watch some Netflix documentary, thinks they know exactly what a cult or a new religious movement is, and they think they know exactly how they work, and they think they're all the same.
And the stereotypes about cults and about who becomes involved in cults are basically thriving.
I was astounded at the difference between the way academia approaches this subject and the way everyone else approaches this subject.
If this brainwashing exists, why aren't way more people joining these groups?
Where do you rank the Mormons? Do you think they progressed up the scale like you were talking about? Do you think they're in the sect position or the church position? What do you see?
Yeah.
What are we dealing with here? We are so lucky to have with us today Dr. Lorne Dawson. Dr. Lorne Dawson is a scholar of new religious movements and radicalization. One of the best in the world, in my opinion. I read some of his books. We'll put the links in the description to those so you can get those and read them yourself. Before you introduce yourself, Dr. Dawson, I just wanted to point out that Dr. Dawson recently actually joined a new religious movement, a cult, if you will, the cult of pickleball. We're both a member of this cult, and we both love it, and it's been great. But Dr. Dawson, you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm sitting here actually a little bone weary because we had 2.5 hours of play yesterday, and I ended up finding myself playing with the really good competitive players. So I was the weak link, but I was running myself crazy around the court trying to stay competitive with them. So that takes its toll. But I learned a lot. I learned how to, master a few things I wasn't doing so well before. Yeah, so I'm Lorne Dawson. I'm up here in Canada, so I'm retired now, but I spent about 20 odd years of my career mainly studying new religious movements, and then that transition into study of processes of radicalization in a terrorist context. The obvious connection was because of the early amount of, after 9/11, the Islamic terrorism situation, governments were very interested in bringing in scholars that knew about radical religious contexts. So the things have naturally flowed together. So I will say this, I don't consider myself like a contemporary right on the spot, a scholar of new religious movements anymore. As a lot of the new stuff has happened. But I was really heavily involved and fairly prominent in this sort of classical period, the 80s, 90s, beginning of the 21st century, when new religious movement scholarship, the foundations were really laid. So,
oh yeah, that's the cult renaissance right there. You were right in the thick of it, and that actually kind of leads right into where I want to go with this. So, people are going to have so many presuppositions. People are going to think they have it all figured out with regards to cults or new religious movements, and we'll get into the distinction. But can you maybe just, before we get into it, what is a cult? Why do we say the word cult? And what is the difference in the way people see a cult maybe in the media or the way they see it in the scholarship? And what are some of those presuppositions that you might like people to maybe break down a little bit before we really get into the meat of today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to say things that'll cross over into stuff we'll go back into again later. But you're right. I mean, I from my perspective, it's sort of sad, because in a sense, we had this sort of what was called the Great American Cult Scare in the late 70s going into the 80s. And that's when Hare Krishna, Church of Scientology, the Unification Church of the Moonies, just to cite 3 examples, were really becoming very prominent, and they were receiving a tremendous amount of media attention. And mainly, they never really actually recruited large numbers of people. But the problem was they recruited mainly like university students. They recruited young, bright, engaged people, and often off of university campuses, and young people were leaving law school to go spend their time proselytizing for the Unification Church. And these religions were from outside of North America, outside of the United States. Well, Scientology isn't, but many of them were. And they were just totally new. There were these kinds of, I got to qualify that already. There have been Asian religions in Canada and the United States since late 19th century, but never so prominently, never on sort of a mass scale. And so there was a kind of shock element here. And as a result, of course, media got heavily involved in following these groups and talking to parents and the scandals around them. and then parents organized, and there were legal actions taken against these groups. So it really did cause a major, dust up in popular culture and legal culture, and then that started to penetrate into scholarship. And to some extent, it happened through legal cases. People aren't aware that there were well over 100 legal cases, not minor ones, quite large ones, dealing with new religious movements. And so everyone starts calling on people to be expert witnesses at trials, where parents are suing the new religious movements, or they may even be suing their own kids, or the kids are suing the parents for things they did. And the courts didn't know what to do. So you had these self-appointed cult experts arise who charged money in order to, offer the testimony and to rescue kids. Scholars then started thinking, well, this is really getting distorted. There's no real sort of clear, rational understanding of what's going on here. So in a way, the controversy kicked off serious scholarship, an attempt to approach it the way sociologists, psychologists, religious studies scholars would approach any other topic. And so we had this whole discussion, and we thought it had come to a sort of a logical conclusion by the late 1990s into the early 21st century. Almost all courts around the world, but especially in the United States, had started to pass quite significant judgments saying that this expertise offered by self-appointed cult experts was not scientific and could not be submitted to courts. And so in a sense, the scholars felt that they had achieved a kind of social and intellectual victory because they were being recognized with their scholarship as the proper experts. Now, I'll go back to why am I disappointed? Because, of course, that all fades with time. And we've seen people reverting back to notions about cults and how automatically pernicious and negative all cults are. And the stereotypes about cults and about who becomes involved in cults are back basically and thriving. And so we don't have the legal fights happening anymore because, of course, legal precedents do stand. But in the popular culture, and now with social media and with YouTube and everything, right, that whole sort of struggle around what is a cult and, are cults automatically evil, etc., has all come back in spades. So in a sense, the scholarship's been forgotten. Now, that's in a way not answering your question. I mean, we'll have to get into it, I guess, with more detail. But
yeah, absolutely. And it perfectly answered my question. And I mean, everyone will see. All you have to do is go type the word cult into YouTube, and you'll see that it's the non-scholarly and just sensational approach to the topic, and almost never the academic topic. When I was getting into your books, I was reading a little bit up on those court cases like US v. Fishman and things like that. I was astounded at the difference between the way academia approaches this subject and the way everyone else approaches this subject. And we used it a little bit, but part of that difference is even the word cult itself. Your book, Understanding Cults, the Sociology of New Religious Movements, you kind of give the pop definition, and then in the subtitle, you're saying, okay, this is what's actually going on. This is what we're actually doing here. Can you walk us through maybe where does that word come from, and how are scholars using it? How are people using it? And what are some of the issues with defining what a cult is and how we know?
Yeah, so I'll have to give kind of a thumbnail sketch of a pretty complicated history, but basically, the term cult is a term that's been around in context of study of religion for as long as people have been studying religion. And cult, I was thinking of an example I could use here. So let's say within Catholicism, people talk about the cult of Virgin Mary. Now, in that context, all it means is within Catholicism, there are some elements or schools or groups of people who have really particularly focused on the role of the Virgin Mary. And for some people, they may say, well, they've almost elevated the Virgin Mary to a level of equal of Jesus, or they're even more preoccupied with Virgin Mary than Jesus. Now, all that really means is it's a cult because they really focus on rites, prayers, rituals, doctrine around the Virgin Mary. And the term cult, in a sort of very old scholarly sense, mainly refers to sort of ritual practices. Any kind of religion that's heavily focused on the ritual component sort of garnered this term cult. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, sociologists started to try to develop sort of categories for different types or modes of religiosity. And Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch, just to say two sort of leading scholars, they created a distinction between sectarian forms of religion, so sects, religious sects, and churches. And they did this to be able to understand how religions are evolving and changing, and what are the social processes and pressures within religions. And so we should maybe come back and talk about what the differences between sects and churches are. So I'll just leave that aside for the moment.
Yeah,
and then Weber didn't have this notion of cult, but Troeltsch introduced the idea of cult. But the cult was sort of a residual category. He recognized there were styles of religion that didn't really neatly fit in the sect box, and they didn't neatly fit in the church box, so they created this cult box. And I think he really had in mind sort of mystical, metaphysical groups, what today we might sort of call New Age movements. These things have existed, again, for thousands of years in the West. The technical term from scholars is metaphysical movements. So they are, again, groups that are very interested in ritual and ceremony and very interested in mystical experiences. They're very personal. They tend to be very small groups. So you've had groups throughout the West that have maybe thought they were practicing ancient Egyptian religion, according to what archaeologists were telling them they were, right? So it's things like that. So that's fine.
Sorry to interrupt, but at this point, was it a term that had such negative connotation as it does today, or was it just sort of a category?
Just a category. It was a fuzzy category compared to sectarianism in church, which were really quite well worked out in historical examples, but it's not well worked out. And then some later scholars in the 30s, Howard Becker, for example, American sociologist, they tried to develop these categories further, and they tried to develop the notion of cult more as a kind of also an effective category for very personal forms of religion that weren't very organized, religions that were small, religions that were about maybe some leader coming up with some ideas and people gathering in a home and practicing a set of ideas, that hadn't really arisen to the status of being an organization, right? Still remained a kind of fuzzy notion. But before it could ever be properly developed, by about the mid-20th century, the term cult got hijacked by essentially American Protestant evangelical theologians who were engaged in a kind of doctrinal disputes with groups like the Church of Latter-day Saints and with the Jehovah's Witnesses and with the Christian Scientists and with Seventh-day Adventists, because they saw that these new religions were growing and prospering in America, and they felt a threat to mainstream Christianity, especially their evangelical conceptions of it, right? So they then wrote books which were critiques of these religions, of their doctrines, basically arguing that they're heterodox, right? That they're heresy in some form or another. And they applied the term cult in a highly pejorative sense to these groups. They applied it as a way of basically saying they're not Christian, they're not proper churches, and they should be. They didn't ask for out and out legal suppression, but they certainly were trying to encourage social and cultural suppression of these groups. And that's the term that then in the 60s, when the new religious movements, so-called new religious movements happened, when you had the groups I mentioned like Hare Krishna come into the United States or the Unification Church, people picked up on that kind of popular evangelical conception of cult with all its pejorative negative connotations and applied it to these new religions as well. And by the time scholars became involved again, they recognized this term had sort of been contaminated too much. So I used it in the title of my book just because, to be honest, it's a way of making sure someone picks it up off a shelf, right? Because it's the lightning term. But as you said, the subtitle is The Sociology of New Religious Movements, because that's the more neutral term academics started to frame. We're just dealing with new religions. They're at the movement stage, so their level of organization may be somewhat limited. They're certainly nothing like churches. They haven't arrived at that stage yet, but they're just beginning. And as I always said in my teaching for 25 years. I taught a quite large course on new religious movements, always a very, very popular topic. And I always stress at the very beginning of the course is we have to recognize that Christianity, like all religions, but I use the context of Christianity, started as a new religious movement, of course, right? You have one guy named Jesus. He's got 12 guys around him, right? And miracles, he can supposedly has performed miracles. And you can see where I'm going, right? And I always said, let's look at the early Christian church from the perspective of a Roman citizen. They would see it looking just as strange, just as weird, just as outlandish, small. It would fit all the negative pejorative concepts of cult could be applied to it that an American in 1970 might have wanted to apply to the Hare Krishna movement or something of that nature. So we started to develop this whole, science of new religious movements and to treat them in a neutral manner. Now, I'm going to caution here. That does not mean, so the anti-cultists then said that anyone using this term was a cult apologist. And yes, we were trying to defend the right of these groups to freedom of religious expression under the Constitution and to not be legally suppressed. That does not mean that there was no awareness of abuses that could happen in these groups, because of course abuses do happen. Just as was always pointed out, abuses happen in the Roman Catholic Church, abuses happen in the Church of Latter-day Saints, abuses happen in every single religious organization you could think of. But you need to work with individual cases, individual instances, and not draw, stereotypical negative condemnations of these groups. And so I'll bring in one other component that I didn't mention earlier, and that is the groups are being stigmatized. But then part of this process was also to suggest that those that would join a new religious movement were somehow weak and vulnerable. They were gullible individuals who were being taken advantage of by cunning, cult leaders, etc. That position struggles a bit with the fact that when you can demonstrate that the people who are joining new religious movements are overwhelmingly middle class, I'll be honest, white kids coming from universities, that kind of thing, then you're kind of saying, well, in what way is this privileged class of young people, weak and vulnerable and gullible, etc.? It didn't seem to fit. And that then led to what we're going to be talking about, I know, is that led to this whole notion of brainwashing. That somehow, even though these are privileged kids, they have found themselves in circumstances where they have been subjected to an extraordinary process that got labeled brainwashing, so that they got drawn in against their will. They were coerced psychologically into joining these organizations.
So, and this is, I love this topic. This is like the most fascinating topic to me. Anywhere where anytime I read something and just all of my preconceived ideas are just totally destroyed, those are my favorite topics. And this is one of those for me that I was like, everything I thought was completely wrong. Like everything that I had in mind about what a cult is and what a new religious movement is, it's totally wrong. And wait, let me grab this next. Oh yeah. So it's something that really struck me as kind of breaking down my bias was when you talked about, and you mentioned a little bit earlier, the church sect cult distinction. Could you maybe go into a little bit more detail about what makes something a church, what makes something a sect, and what makes something a cult?
Yeah, no, again, this is a technical topic. There's abundant literature on it. I've published several pieces on it. So I'm just, again, going to be kind of general with it, right? But having said that, churches are large organizations that strive to be inclusive. The object is to bring in as many people as possible under the umbrella of the church. Churches are largely organizations into which people are born. They usually have hierarchical structures. Usually the leadership works its way through some kind of educational system to rise into a position of authority in the church. And they tend to be very focused on doctrine and certain sort of set ritual practice. Now, a sectarian group, and this is really why the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of attention is drawn to them, is with the Protestant Reformation, you're essentially getting the rise of sectarian groups, Protestantism, out of the Roman Catholic Church. So sects are groups that break free of churches. They engage in what's called schisms, right? So they are entities that are breaking away from mainstream organizations. That's usually under the leadership of some kind of charismatic, strong leader or a set of leaders initially. They are much more interested in piety and kind of sincerity of belief than worried about doctrinal, restrictions and necessities. And along with that piety comes much stronger demands on behavior, on ethical principles, on people making sure all aspects of their lives conform to certain sort of fundamental emotional and ethical expectations. So as a result, they end up being exclusive. Rather than trying to include everybody, they put up barriers and they want people to prove that they warrant being able to join the sectarian group. So they're almost all their membership initially is from conversion. So, but as a result, they also tend to be a little less organized, a little more amorphous, a little less clearly worked out understanding of their relationship to the rest of society. And to just fill in, the continuum then going through to cults is you're just getting more personal, even more charismatic, even less organized. You can sort of see where it's going. So under the theory, and this is from American scholarship, is these categories are not static. So H. Richard Niebuhr, an American theologian and historian and sociologist, argued that when you look at the American situation, sectarian groups tend to slowly evolve over time into churches. It's logical, right? Once that first generation's not involved, then their children are just born into a sect, right? As a sect grows, it wants to include more people, so it drops its standards a bit to be a little bit more inclusive. As a sect survives for a long time, and naturally a hierarchy starts to arise. Internal authority structures arise, and so those internal authorities try to protect their positions of power. So they require maybe some educational requirements. So you can't just be a charismatic figure and get up and preach church and preach. You have to have certain qualifications to preach. So sects tend to evolve into churches, and then to some extent cults, some of them that are successful, tend to evolve into sects or even eventually into churches. And you can't be fooled by the fact that people will assign the label church to themselves. When they do, they're trying to legitimize themselves. But like the Unification Church in Korea, maybe a church. In North America, it's never been anything other than a small movement that maybe moved into to the level from cult to a sect from a sociological perspective. So these things are all matter of judgment by working through details and deciding if enough criteria have been met. And we haven't defined what a cult is. I don't know if you want to do that, but
yeah,
we've been talking in broad terms, but there is a more detailed sociological conception of a cult or a new religious movement. But
I'd love to hear that. What is like the scholarly definition of a cult?
Yeah.
How can we
So,
break that down?
In saying that, it's like so many things in the world, in fact, there is no consensus, right, on what it is. Just like, in fact, as people are often surprised, that we have no consensus definition of what a religion is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's endless dispute. It's been going on for hundreds of years, right? And I can assure you there's no agreement as to what constitutes a religion or doesn't constitute a religion. So you just have different camps and perspectives and points of view. And
this is the way I see it, too. I was in my first ever philosophy class, and my professor asked us to define a chair. And every time one of us gave an example, he would say, so he'd come up with a counterexample. So we would say, piece of furniture you can sit on, has 4 legs. And he'd say, all right, my bed is a chair.
Yeah.
And we'd, no, we'd have to come up with a different definition. And I see this religion, in my philosophy of religion class, we spent the first 3 hours defining what a religion is, and no one could really do it. And it's important to note. I really like that you noted that we're dealing with broad categories here. Some things are going to be more religious. Some things are going to be less religious. Not everything fits into clean buckets.
And people tend to go for definitions. Again, I'm going to use a term I just used in a slightly different context. Definitions tend to be, oh, I favor one that's a little more inclusive. So it includes some things that people wouldn't automatically call religion. I'm going to include in religions. Other people prefer a more exclusive definition, and they would remove things. And the classic example here is Buddhism, because technically under the most sort of early forms of Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, Pali Canon, etc., one of the foundational principles of Buddhism is there's no soul and there's no God. That kind of surprises people. So we would always assume, well, Buddhism's a religion. Well, but how do you deal with the fact that it has no belief? If you take one of the oldest, most pristine forms of it, it rejects the idea of a soul and it rejects the idea of God. So that poses major problems. But clearly the way it's practiced around most of the world, it looks and smells like and looks, it walks and talks like a dog, so it must be a dog. It looks like a religion, right? And so you get all these disputes. So one way of approaching this is we recognize this is true for words like love, justice, politics. Almost every major term we use is subject to these disputes. They're contested concepts. So same is true of cults. But there's a recognition that you can use you can go to Ludwig Wittgenstein's approach, right, out of ordinary language philosophy, and use what's called a family resemblance approach. So you assemble some characteristics that are pretty pervasively present in the phenomenon, and then basically say, if something has a lot of these features, it probably warrants being included in the category. So the ones that I sort of worked out as a consensus is a new religious movement or a cult is usually focused around or started with some highly charismatic leader, and usually continues to operate under charismatic leadership for a long time. Even if it's not the original leader, then you get a secondary leader who's there because of their personal charisma, not because of their educational qualifications or whatever the case may be. Second, it usually is focused on some kind of esoteric body of knowledge, right? And this can either be a body of some secret special knowledge that's being imparted to membership of the group. This can be reclaiming some lost ancient knowledge, like Egyptian religion and practices. It can be something totally new, a new revelation. Gods have spoken to the person and revealed something new. Or it can be pointing towards some kind of inner capacity or potential within people that they don't realize is there, that can be revealed in some way. And usually it's some combination of all three of those things. And then it also involves then some kind of technique, some kind of quick technique or method by which people can seize upon this knowledge and transform their lives. And the transformation is more proximate, is the term that's used. It's nearer, it's easier to get at, you can do it quicker. All you got to do is chant these words and meditate for 15 minutes every morning, and do that within 3 months, your whole life will be transformed, as opposed to, let's say, going to Mass in the Catholic Church and being a good Catholic every day of your life for, years on end. And then finally, they tend to be so focused on personal development and individual transformation that they don't tend to have broader social policies or orientations. They're not worrying about, larger issues in society. They're talking about individuals' emotional and psychological needs and their salvation, right? So those are the sort of categories that mainly mark off a new religious movement. So again, we can see that if you applied those criteria, I'm obviously thinking of your audience, if you apply those criteria to the very early stages of the Mormons, then essentially it looks, from a sociological perspective, Mormonism developed as a new religious movement, as a cult, initially. But as I said, so did Christianity.
Yeah. And so just in your professional opinion, where would you say, and my audience is going to be super curious, whether Latter-day Saint or not, where do you rank the Mormons? Do you think they progressed up the scale like you were talking about? Do you think they're in the sect position or the church position? What do you see having happened what are we dealing with here?
Yeah, I think in a detailed analysis, it really brings out the sort of fuzziness of these categories, because the other thing I didn't mention is these terms are relative, right? And geographically relative. We kind of mentioned they're relative over time, but they're relative even geographically. So if you look at, the Church of Latter-day Saints within the state of Utah, it is it's a church. It thinks of itself as a church. It operates like a church, though it has decidedly still sectarian aspects to it, right? In terms of more stringent requirements on people, behavioral demands, setting up symbolic and physical barriers between members and non-members, right? Things of that nature. Now, all religions have that, so it's a matter of degree. So it's, varies from subcategories like established sect through to, sometimes people call it ecclesia, which means a kind of geographically dominant church organization. But if you go to southern Alberta, where I started my career teaching, about a third of the population of southern Alberta are Mormon. And that's where the primary Canadian temple is, right? In McGrath.
I didn't even know that. That's crazy.
Yep. And so Mormons came up from Utah and settled there in the mid 19th century, late 19th century, and are dominant there. And so when I first taught there, because I was teaching courses on religion, I was told by my colleagues, be careful about everything you say about the Church of Latter-day Saints, because the odds are upwards of 30% of the students sitting in your class will be Mormons, right? So, just be sensitive to that fact, right?
And if you really upset them, they might say something like "darn it" or "dang it." Get real mad.
I know. Just as an aside, because it was fascinating, the temple at McGrath was rededicated when I was there, so I got a chance to go tour it, because for a week, right, they opened it up to the public to be able to go see it. It was really an incredible experience. And in the southern Alberta, it is a sect, but a very well-established sect, right, with sort of a high degree of respectability. But of course, if you were to go to Quebec in Canada, taking an example, then in a province that is highly secular now, but its history is staunchly Roman Catholic, the Latter-day Saints would be seen as an outlandish cult, as some kind of strange group that is practicing heterodox ideas, or ideas that most of the population would be opposed to. So it's, as you see, it's kind of all over the map. So I would say that it's curious that the Latter-day Saints are in this kind of transition stage. In parts of the world, they've been able to evolve into a respected church. And I'd say, of course, politically and socially in the United States overall, they've arrived at a church status, certainly a denomination status, right? And only in some places, I assume probably still in the southern United States, in some locales, Mormon missionaries probably have a hard time, right? Because if they're going to encounter a community that is largely, hardcore, let's say Southern Baptist community, they're going to have reasons to be opposed to the Latter-day Saints and see them as heretics, because they see them as competitors, right? So
yeah, you're describing my mission. I mean, Southwest Texas, it's a lot of very Calvinist leaning people, and I mean, they would definitely see us as a cult. I mean, and they'd probably use the more like theological pejorative definition. They definitely haven't read up, or most of them haven't read up on your work and others. But I mean, and it's funny you were saying too, it's like if strangeness or heresy is like what a cult is, then like I'll be the first one to tell you, Latter-day Saints are a cult, man. We're really strange, and we believe all sorts of Christian heresies. So like it just depends on what you say is the criteria. And as we're talking about, it's like there's this what was the word Wittgenstein used? Family grouping.
Yeah, family resemblance.
Family resemblance, and it's not as clear as everyone thinks it is, and I think that's hilarious. But I think that's a really good launch pad, this talking about strangeness and going out and proselyting and trying to get other people to be a part of your religion. Let's talk about the brainwashing thing. So what is brainwashing? Does it exist? At least the way pop media presents it. Does brainwashing exist?
Yeah, so the origins of the term comes from the Korean War, because American prisoners of war were communist Chinese used them as tools of propaganda. So some captured American fighter pilots and things of that nature were subjected to really strenuous imprisonment and coercive techniques. And basically, of course, they were promised some relief from the torturous conditions they were under if they would be recorded making statements against the United States. And some people did that, right? And we should have nothing but mercy and pity for those individuals, right? Some people could withstand those torturous conditions, some couldn't. And so the term that the Chinese characters that were used for these programs of thought reform that they applied to these prisoners were brain and washing, just the ideograms. And so Americans seized on this and invented the term brainwashing. And Robert J. Lifton, a very prominent American scholar, wrote a book in 1961 on thought reform in China, because the Chinese, of course, eventually applied these re-education programs to their own citizens. And started this whole, he tried to do it academically, but had a bit of a popular element to it, and was rapidly picked up by others, this notion that people could be totally transformed, that virtually you could go from being one kind of person to another kind of person if you were subjected to these sophisticated physical and psychological techniques to change your mind, so to speak, right? And get you to do things you don't want to do. And so, of course, you have things like the movie The Manchurian Candidate, where an American prisoner of war comes back to the United States, and he's been trained to assassinate the president of the United States, right? He's an American, but he's been totally converted to the communist Chinese perspective. And he's a kind of a zombie-like character, right? He can be triggered by certain key words said to him, and he'll launch into his indoctrination, his programming. Now, when parents saw their youngish adult children, joining the new religious movement, some of them seized on this notion of brainwashing, which was circulating, to be able to convince the courts that these young people no longer were in proper control of themselves. They didn't have competency. And so to get the competency laws used so that the parents would be granted guardianship over their adult children, so that they could legally take control of their lives, and they could legally send the police in, or if the police didn't want to do it, they could hire deprogrammers like Ted Patrick to go in, literally kidnap their children, bring them home, and decondition them, deprogram them was the term that came up, right? So basically lock them up in a hotel room for weeks on end, bombard them, and try and get them to admit the error of their ways and come back to their family. And so that then meant this ended up in the courts, right? Is brainwashing really something that exists or doesn't exist? And so that started quite a bit of scholarship about it. What got lost in the shuffle was the CIA did a massive study of the American prisoners of war when they returned back from the war, about their condition, about whether they were brainwashed. Because, of course, to be honest, the Americans said, gee, if the Chinese could brainwash people, this could be pretty useful to us. Can we do it too, right? And so they hired two good psychologists from the States, and people don't know about this because, of course, the document was classified for the longest period of time. But eventually it became declassified in the 70s, and I'm forgetting the authors right now, regrettably. But what they basically demonstrated through very comprehensive study of the 60-odd prisoners that had been subjected to brainwashing and returned to the United States is that they said conclusively, there is no such thing as brainwashing. They said these prisoners were subject to torture, and they were just out of fear of being subjected to further torture, some were willing to capitulate. But as soon as they got home, most of them said, God, I don't believe any of that stuff. I just could not tolerate another 20 sleepless nights and living on a horrible limited diet of water and bread or whatever, so I surrendered. I gave in. But that information just got lost in the wake of popular concern about new religious movements and brainwashing. And the idea of brainwashing has never gone away then. So after 9/11, when The 19 individuals launched those attacks, those grievous attacks on the United States, and the whole world became galvanized. The early response was, why would anyone do this? Why would anyone, get on a plane and fly it into a building and die? And they were radical Islamist terrorists. So the notion of brainwashing started to circulate again. Clearly, they couldn't possibly have wanted to do this. They must have been brainwashed. And as we got suicide terrorism happening pervasively around the world, the argument was no one would die that way. And you just pause for a moment and say, this seems a very strange idea. I mean, the example I always use is my grandfather fought in the First World War, right? He didn't think anything about if his commanding officers told him, well, go over there and launch that attack. It's a hopeless situation. You're almost certainly going to die on it. He would have died for king and country, right? Without even thinking about it. And nobody would have said, well, he's brainwashed. People die for causes all over the world. People die, regrettably, very sincerely in support of things they think are extremely important. And sometimes that also means it crosses the line that they're willing to do terrorist acts against people. So whatever. But these brainwashing ideas stay in strong circulation. They stay in strong circulation because the people who, if you're a person who's joined a new religious movement and you've caused a lot of disruption to your family, and you've suffered stigma from the community, and then maybe now you've decided, well, I'm really not interested in this group anymore, and I'd like to get back into a normal life. It's a way of absolving yourself. You're not responsible for your actions, for what you did. I was brainwashed. I didn't know what I was doing, right? And then the families are reluctant to admit maybe something was missing or lacking in the way we raised these children, and that they needed something that they weren't getting from the rest of society, but they somehow thought they could get from this group. So if they were brainwashed, it absolves them from having to look very closely at their own context. And I'll qualify that by saying, overwhelmingly, the people that join new religious movements, as careful scientific studies revealed with thousands of individuals, the majority were coming from secular, non-religious families or backgrounds. Disproportionately, in terms of statistics, Jewish people join new religious movements proportionally, way out of proportion with the Jewish population in the United States. But when you examine carefully, they were always from very secular Jewish homes. So there are homes where people grew up with a bit of sense of religion and religious identity, but very little practice, very little real sense of how they would pursue a spiritual aspect to their lives. So there's something wanting, something missing for these individuals. And along came Hare Krishna, with very elaborate practices, etc., and they found that appealing and attractive. It filled a void within them. So just I'll throw in another factor here. Like, this is probably the most important fact, and I'll bore you with citing the empirical studies it's based on, other than to say it's based on two independent studies done by completely different individuals in completely different contexts with extremely large scientific samples. And in both those studies, it was demonstrated that, first of all, only a tiny percentage of people contacted by a new religious movement ever join, like a fraction of 1%. And 90% of the individuals who join a new religious movement leave voluntarily of their own accord in less than 2 years. And what that tends to tell you is it was something they need. There was some need that they had to get satisfied, usually probably around identity. And once they worked out those things and satisfied that needs and maybe matured and figured out something about their own psychology, they often said, well, I don't need to be a dedicated member of this new religious movement. They often don't reject the ideas, but they said, I can go back to being a normal person, leading a normal life, and maybe I will continue to meditate, and maybe I will continue chanting, but I'm also going to go back to school and train to be a doctor, or whatever the case may be.
Huh. That is fascinating. So would you say that these extensive empirical studies on the amount of people that leave new religious movements voluntarily, I'm not a sociologist, but that seems to me like a death blow to the to the brainwashing allegation. It's like 90% of their converts leave voluntarily because they're brainwashed. That just doesn't make sense to me.
No, and that's really one of the key things, sort of breaking it down. There are a lot of other variables, but the hardcore bottom line data just doesn't fit. If you're brainwashed, then assumably first of all, if there's brainwashing exists, why aren't way more people joining these groups? Yeah. And then secondly, if you're brainwashed, why aren't you staying in these groups? Why isn't there higher levels of retention? And so that breaks it down. Now, just as a background, one study was based on literally 800 individuals who had been in new religious movements and done by a very prominent psychiatrist. The other study was done of the Unification Church in the United Kingdom by a very prominent sociologist, and had a sample of every single person who had attended a Unification Church event over 1 year in the United Kingdom. So thousands of individuals. So I'm bringing up the two differences because one's based on clinical psychological interviews by a leading psychiatrist. The other one is based on surveys and interviews and participant observation by a sociologist. So you have sociologists and psychiatrists often disagree. Their modus operandi are different, and yet the results, and these studies were done in the same year but completely independently, no knowledge of each other, and came up with exactly the same finding. So nothing's definitive in this world, but that's very strong evidence that probably this is factually correct.
Yeah. And so when I was reading more into the U.S. v. Fishman case, for example, I believe in 1990, I was reading the amicus briefs of the APA and the ASA that they sent in. And I was just astounded at how bold they were in asserting that this isn't scientifically viable sufficient to be accepted in a court case. So, yeah. I mean, like what you're saying, these two, there and many more, presumably, very reliable empirical studies on brainwashing, and you combine that with the fact that you can't use it in a court case anymore anywhere in the United States. I'm not sure what Canada does. I'm sure it's probably
no. And there was all these lags, and in European courts accepted notions of brainwashing long after the American situation, partly because the influx of new religious movements to Europe was a little later. But even again, the European courts all eventually started to say, no, this is not a viable entity. So
this is one of the most common comments I see. I mean, not just on our own page, but everywhere. Like you'll see videos, a political video or a political post, and it's almost the first comment. One party is accusing the other. You have people on the left accusing followers or voters of Donald Trump in the United States, a cult of Trump, that are brainwashed into Trump. And then you have the people on the right who are accusing those of being in the cult of wokeness or brainwashed by wokeness. So, and maybe we can kind of leave it off here. How can we fix this? How can we say, how can we be more aligned with the data? What is your invitation to people in these comment sections and in these political conversations and in these religious conversations? How can we better align with the data when we're talking to each other, just so we're not mudslinging?
Yeah. I mean, I think the term brainwashing, like so many others, even like the term cult, it hides more than it reveals, right? It obscures things, right? It actually throws everybody off track. But part of this is because people are very reluctant to understand, and this applies right across the board. People often come to what appear to be extreme positions or unusual positions through very normal processes. Through very normal processes of curiosity, inquisitiveness, doing their own research, etc., and through slowly learning about a set of ideas and finding them somehow cogent or appealing. So then the key thing becomes to figure out is, why did they find them appealing, right? And this is not rocket science either. People are drawn to things that are satisfying some need, that make them feel better. And so you've got to think about, what is it that about these movements or these ideas that are helping people to better cope with their lives, to feel more satisfied with their situation in the world. And if they're willing to find that satisfaction in an extreme set of ideas that will bring about contention and struggle and fight and maybe rupture with their own families, then you've got to figure there's some really urgent need that is being satisfied. If you're willing to alienate your brothers or your sisters or your parents, etc., which again, just to put an aside, of course, Christ said the same thing, right? He said, I didn't come to unite mothers and daughters, etc. I've come to separate them, right? And he didn't mean that in some absolute sense, but he meant you're drawn to the truth, and if you're drawn to what you see as the truth, then it's going to set you in tension with others. And so what we need to do is understand what are these things that are being satisfied. And the best contender, to use another broad term, are about identity issues. And this has come up in the radicalization literature pretty strongly too, and with good social experimental psychological work, and also field work supporting it. And you can just see it when you're reading and interacting with these individuals, is that a great deal is about the confusion in our world today. I'll put it in simplistic terms. People are confronted with too many choices, too many options, too many variations, too much grayness. It's a very confusing world to live in right now, and people want certainty. They want some clarity. They want to know what's right and what's wrong, and they want to, for good reason, to be aligned with what they think is right. They want to feel good about themselves, and they want to feel that they're morally aligned with the right perspective. And so, regrettably, in a world with a great deal of sort of murkiness, the more extreme perspectives are the ones that have the clarity at the moment. Now, I will factor in here, having more education is a bit of a factor, not always, because, of course, people who have more education or more resources have more capacity to handle some of that murkiness, to recognize that because things are complicated doesn't necessarily mean that there's no answers, right? It just means you got to work harder at figuring out the answers. But it's perfectly reasonable for someone to work harder at figuring out the answers and decide that some of these unusual ideas are maybe not so unusual, that they're very beneficial, that they're very helpful. So over and over again, I could cite dozens of other fields of research I've been involved in, where when you work through it, it always comes back to this: how do people benefit from something? If someone's engaging in something you think is outlandish, the answer is rarely that they are outlandish, or rarely that they are psychologically damaged. The answer is almost always, here's a person with some real need that's not getting met. And some people might say, oh, well, then it's all about psychological weakness. I think the needs are often more existential. They're people's needs for deep and serious meaning in their lives, for value, for some kind of significance to their existence, that they're not just a little nobody in the world, that they're part of a bigger process that's somehow having a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. And what you were talking about reminded me of this quote from Bertrand Russell, where he said, the problem with the world is that the fools and fanatics are always certain of themselves, and the wiser people are full of doubts. And what you're saying, I love this quote. And I see it very specifically with this topic. Everyone, because they watch some Netflix documentary, thinks they know exactly what a cult or a new religious movement is, and they think they know exactly how they work, and they think they're all the same. And the wise, like scholars like yourself, are very nuanced, and they say, look, there's not any, we don't know why everyone joins cults. We don't know why everyone joins churches or sects. And it's not a monolith. We can't just say that it's all the same thing. And so I really, really, if people don't take anything else from that, from today's interview, I would just say, take that home with you. That's a really, really cool thing that you just said there. And
yeah, and always try and stand outside of your natural, standpoint or perspective, right? Recognize that everybody doesn't see the world the way you see it. And so you need to understand, this is a sociological term, their definition of the situation. If you can understand from their perspective, role play, how they define the situation, you may say, boy, I totally disagree with that definition. But at least once you've been able to empathetically understand what their definition of the situation is, you can enter into dialogue, because you can start to understand, all right, I see how you're seeing it. I don't see it that way. But can we talk about then how we see it differently and why we see it differently? And maybe there's ways in which we can find out that our viewpoints aren't really all that drastically different on the key points, the really important things.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, you've said everything that you can possibly say, and I'd probably just leave everyone with an invitation to join the cult of pickleball, because for me, that's absolutely filled all those needs. I don't feel like a little person on a giant spinning blue ball anymore. It gives me purpose, and I just encourage everyone to go check it out. That's my invitation. I'm a Latter-day Saint. Play some pickleball. It'll make your life better.
It's such a great social activity. I mean, all sports are, but pickleball really seems to attract a diversity of people. We newly moved to where we are now, right, a couple of years ago, because we retired and built a house on a lake. And we've come to know literally hundreds of people in our surrounding community by meeting them on a pickleball court, right?
Yeah.
And then having a little social activity with them afterwards. And so, yeah, it's fantastic.
And I just got to say before we close up, the Salt Lake Temple, the first one built like in the West after the Saints were driven out of the eastern side of the country, it's opening up in 2027, I believe, for another open house, which is the first time since it was constructed. And
wow.
If you're in the area, it'll be open for 6 months, I think, longest open house ever. If you ever in the Western United States, come by and we'll play some pickleball. We'll have you, and we'd love to just play a little bit of pickleball, go see the temple, and you always got a place to stay in Utah.
It'd be great to see, because the temple in McGrath's relatively small, but is quite beautiful inside, and the artwork and the murals, etc., were really intriguing, and really gave a sense of the pioneer background of the group too.
Yeah, it's really cool. And this is totally an aside. We might even cut this out, but they recently changed. I don't know how long ago that was, but they recently changed all the temple artwork, and so all of the temple artwork is unique to each temple. So it used to be that like you'd find some artwork in the temple, some paintings in the temple, and you'd also maybe find them outside in a church building or in a church office building or something like that. But they're all unique to the temples now, and all of them are very, very focused on the area that they're in, and it's really, really cool. I'm kind of a nerd about artwork, but
yeah, no, as I say, I can, as I'm sitting here right now, and that was a long time ago, it was 20. Almost 30 years ago that I saw it, but I can literally visualize the artwork right now. And of course, I can also visualize, I went through it with other religious studies scholars, so we were very intrigued at reading the symbolism and trying to figure out what things possibly meant, and wished we could get into the inner sanctum of the temple, which of course we were barred from, but that would have been, for us, an incredible academic experience. We understand why it didn't happen, but it was very fascinating, and I thought it was a very positive experience for the community, because even though they're a dominant group in southern Alberta, there are tensions, and the temple is right next door to the largest native reserve in Canada, the Blood Reserve. And there's always been tensions between the Mormon community and the Native community. And this was an opportunity for a lot of the Native leaders and Native individuals to come through the temple and start dialogue. And I know that it had the effect in McGrath and elsewhere of opening up channels of communication and reconciliation, and solving some of the local problems, tensions that had happened. So it had a very positive benefit. There were people lined up for blocks to go in. So
I think now, I'm not sure what would have been the case back then, but now you're allowed to go into all of the rooms.
Are you? Okay.
Yeah, and they've recently started publishing photos of the inner sanctum, as it were. So I mean, you can just look them up. They're everywhere, okay. And it's really, really cool. I mean, I'm really glad that we're being a little bit more transparent, while also still remaining some sort of level of secrecy. Is kind of like a weird word, but I mean, I guess it works.
Well, I don't know. We're now past the time limit. Probably it'll get cut out. But this is one of the things you got to watch, because what sociology of religion also reveals is that churches that become too inclusive and dilute their standards too much fail, ultimately, right? And that sectarian religions are strong in the United States because they have these still strong behavioral requirements of people, and they still put some barriers up, symbolic or otherwise. So the trick is, how do you balance these things? How do you become more transparent and open and less divisive and more inclusive, yet maintain the integrity of your identity, right? Some strength to it. So just today in the New York Times, there was an article about the garments and about the recent changes in the garments, right? So that embodied it all. That just was to a T, because if those garments went away altogether, that would be one of the symbolic and physical markers of being part of the church that would be gone. There's an interesting dispute as to would that be okay or not okay. It's sociologically, I'd have to honestly say probably it would weaken the church.
Yeah, I agree. And it's always like, I mean, you might have a different perspective, but and obviously I'm very biased, but I really like the high church, low church distinction. I like that we have things like our services and our baptisms and everything. They're available to everyone. Everyone can come. It's like very, very open. And then and I was having lunch with a Orthodox priest in Romania recently. And my whole life, like in my mission especially, people thought that the temple and like the exclusivity and the secrecy was just repulsive. And I was kind of expecting him to echo that, but he was like, he's like, I wish Orthodoxy had something like that. He's like, it's like just something between your people and God. Like, that's really cool. It's like my family, like I don't like my family, we go out, we talk with other people, but like we have family prayers and that's just us. And I don't want anyone in there. And I thought, and I've kind of always been ashamed a little bit of like this. I'm not ashamed. I've always been a little bit weary to talk about it just because it is kind of like a hot button issue, especially when inclusivity is a big push. But he really changed my perspective on that it's okay to have something that's just between your people and God, and I don't have to be super embarrassed about it.
I think being uncomfortable about your faith is in part actually a marker that probably you've got something worthwhile going on. That sounds very bizarre, but it really is what the scholarly record would show, right? Because if you can just talk freely about every aspect of your faith on the subway to any old buddy that's coming along, then really in a sense it probably means there's nothing particularly special or unique or distinctive about what you're believing. And it applies to everything. I mean, I'm reluctant when I'm at a party. People ask me, oh, what's your background? I was a professor. Oh, what'd you do? Sociology. I don't even tell them religious studies, which is what I do as well, because even that will cause tension. If I then told them my students studied new religious movements, well, even more tension. And even worse, if I now say I studied terrorism, it goes up. They're fascinated, but it puts attention. But having said that, I do actually, tell you the truth, end up telling them all those things. I run the risk of them sort of saying, well, he's an odd guy, right?
Yeah.
Because it is what it is, right? And it's an important area that needs to be studied, and I'm proud of studying it, right? But I'm a little leery. I take my time. I kind of suss a person out before I just blurt that out to them. So
yeah, I did the same thing with philosophy. Usually when I tell people, they're just like, oh, so you didn't want to like make money or anything?
Well, I have 3 degrees in religious studies. Which I never would have dreamed in a million years would happen to me. And my father died when I was 17, and he was a businessman, and he would have flipped out if he'd known I was going to do that. It's a big risk, but it's what I found fascinating and intriguing to study, right? I got drawn there. Personally religious in terms of being involved in a religious group, but I guess I sympathize because I changed my major 6 times in my undergraduate degree. I took 5 years to do a 4-year degree. I excelled. I got really good grades and got into a great graduate school as a result. But because I slowly worked towards something that really grabbed me, that really made me interested, right? And as soon as I came closer to something I was really interested in, that's when the grades went through the roof, because I wanted to spend hours and hours reading and thinking about it, right?
That is so cool. And I'm so glad people do it. Like, we need, especially today, it's like very, very big push on like practical education for money. And I'm just someone who thinks that education is valuable in and of itself. So I really hope that the mindset you had doesn't die out. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's going to be really important for people my age.
Okay, I guess that's our wrap.
I'll record a little outro. Thank you so much for coming in, Lorne. This was a excellent conversation. Love to have you back whenever you're interested. You're awesome. You're our guy. So we appreciate it. Do you have any parting words to leave with the viewers?
No, other than it's really been a nice experience. I really enjoyed it. I think this show is very commendable. Watching the other episodes on YouTube, I think, it's a really valuable thing you're doing. And I love the sort of openness and easiness of this whole dialogue and conversation you got going with people. So
thank you. I really appreciate it. Well, thank you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If there's any really good questions, maybe I can pass them on to Dr. Dawson via email or something like that, and we can get back to you if you have any questions. I'll leave Dr. Dawson's books in the description, and any other recommendations that he has to check out. I'll leave those in the description as well. There's also a really good interview that he did on a Canadian TV show, and I'll put that in the description if you want to catch a little bit more about his thoughts on new religious movements. And as always, have a good time, stay curious, and we'll talk to you later.
bye-bye, everybody.